Last week, we talked about the CP14 notice. That notice is often the first balance due notice taxpayers receive after the IRS believes there is money still owed. But what happens if that balance hasn't been resolved? That's where today's notice come in. The CP501. One of the most common questions I hear is, I already received one IRS notice. Why are they sending me another one? If you've asked yourself that question, you are in the right place. Today, we're going to walk through the CP 501 notice together. We'll discuss why you received it, how it's different from the CP 14, what the IRS is trying to communicate, and what your next steps may be. My name is Shane Harris. I am an enrolled agent with Profit First Taxes, and every week I help taxpayers understand IRS notices, resolve tax problems, and make informed decisions before situations become more serious. Let's get started. If you've watched my previous IRS notice videos, you already know Profit First Taxes IRS stress scale. If this is your first time here, you can find this in the CP14 notice video. Today's notice, the CP501, is still a yellow notice. That means pay attention, understand the notice, take appropriate action, but don't assume the worst. The IRS is contacting you again because according to its records, the balance still has been unresolved. That's different from saying immediate enforcement action is taking place. Understanding that distinction is important. Let's see where today's notice fits in the IRS collection timeline. Today, we've moved one step further in the IRS collection process. The CP 501 is essentially the IRS saying, we still show a balance due on your account. This doesn't necessarily mean your situation suddenly became much more worse. It means the IRS is following up because based on its records, the balance remains unpaid. If nothing changes, the IRS may continue sending additional notices. We'll talk about those in the future videos. For today, let's focus on understanding the CP 501. Let's read this notice together. This has quickly become my favorite part of these videos. As with our previous episode, I'm using a sample CP501 notice for educational purposes. Your notice may look slightly different depending on the tax year or your individual circumstances. But the information we're discussing today generally applies to 501 notices. So let's take a look. The first thing I look for, just like every IRS notice, I start by identifying the notice number. Today, that's CP501. Immediately, I know we are in the collections process. That helps me understand what the IRS is trying to communicate before I read anything else. Next, the opening statement. One thing I want you to notice is how the IRS begins this letter. It says, our records show you have unpaid taxes. Those words matter. The IRS isn't saying you intentionally didn't pay. It's saying that based on its records, there is still a balance on the account. That's why I always encourage taxpayers to compare the notice with their own records before making any assumptions. Just like the CP14, you'll see the current balance due near the top of the notice. Again, don't stop reading after you see the amount. Keep going. Understanding where the balance came from is just as important as knowing the numbers itself. The billing summary tells the story of your balance. You'll see items such as tax owed, penalties, interest. As we discussed in the previous video, the goal is understanding, not guessing. Review this section carefully and compare it with your own records. One thing I really appreciate about the CP501 notice is that the IRS acknowledges something many taxpayers don't think about. The notice explains that if you've already paid your balance in full within the last 21 days or already made payment arrangements, you may disregard the notice. That's important because sometimes payments and notices cross in the mail. Receiving the notice doesn't automatically mean the IRS hasn't received your payment yet. That's why I always recommend confirming your account balance before assuming something went wrong. Now, let's continue working our way through this notice together. One thing I want you to notice is that CP501 isn't just telling you there's a balance due. It's also explaining what your options are. That's an important distinction. The IRS isn't simply sending another bill. It's giving you an opportunity to respond before the collection process continues. One of the most important sections of this notice is titled, What You Need to Do Immediately. Whenever I review an IRS notice, this is always one of the first sections I read carefully. Why? Because the IRS is explaining exactly what it expects the taxpayers to do next. If you agree with the balance, the notice explains that payments should be made by the date listed to reduce additional penalties and interest. But notice something else. The IRS doesn't assume every taxpayer agrees with the balance. The notice always explains that if you disagree, you should contact the IRS to review your account. I think that's an important point. Too many taxpayers believe they only have two choices: pay it or ignore it. Sometimes there are other options. The key is understanding your situation before deciding how to move forward. The CP501 also spends more time discussing payment options. It explains that taxpayers may be able to pay electronically, use a debit or credit card, or explore other payment methods. If you've already watched my video explaining IRS payment plans, you know there are several options depending on your circumstances. Today's goal isn't to go through every payment option again. Instead, I simply want to recognize that this notice points you towards those resources. If paying the balance in full isn't realistic today, don't stop reading. Keep learning about your available options. The notice also mentions installment agreements. That's the IRS way of saying if you can't pay everything today, there may be another way to resolve the balance. Remember, the purpose of today's video isn't to determine which option is best for you. It's to help you understand what this notice is communicating. Once you understand the notice, you can begin evaluating the options that fit your particular situation. One thing that surprises many taxpayers is that this notice briefly mentions an offer in compromise. Now, I'm not going to spend much time discussing that program today. An offer in compromise is an entirely separate topic. In fact, it deserves its own video. For today, I simply want you to notice that the IRS is making taxpayers aware of their options. One of the biggest mistakes I see taxpayers make is stopping after page 1. They look at the amount due, fold the notice back up, and never read the remaining pages. But many IRS notices contain valuable information after the first page. Payment options, penalty explanations, interest calculations, taxpayers' rights, additional instructions. Those details matter. That's why I encourage every taxpayer to read the entire notice before deciding what to do next. Let's compare today's notice with the CP14. The CP14 introduced the balance due. The CP501 is following up because according to the IRS, that balance still hasn't been resolved. Notice what hasn't changed. The IRS is still communicating. It's still providing information. It's still encouraging you to address the balance. That's why I continue rating this as a yellow notice on the IRS stress scale. It's important, but it's still an opportunity to respond before later collection notices become more serious. Some people assume that because the notice number changed, everything changed. Not necessarily. The notice number tells us where we are in the collections process. It doesn't automatically tell us that enforcement action is happening today. That's why context matter. That's why understanding the sequences matter. And that's exactly why we're creating this IRS notice series. Because once you understand the process, the notices become much less intimidating. Now, let's talk about the question that almost everyone asks. What happens if I don't respond to the CP501 notice? The answer is the IRS collection process generally continues. Notice I did not say the IRS is going to immediately levy your bank account or that they're going to garnish your wages tomorrow. That is not what this notice says. The CP501 is another reminder that according to the IRS, there is still a balance due. If the balance remains unresolved, the IRS may continue sending additional collection notices. That's exactly why I encourage taxpayers to address the notice sooner rather than later. Generally speaking, the earlier you respond, the more options you have available. One thing I want to stress is this. Not every taxpayer who receives a CP 501 is in the same situation. Some people can pay that balance immediately. Some people qualify for payment arrangements. Some people disagree with the balance. Others may qualify for different types of tax resolution options. That's why I try to avoid giving one size fit all advices. Instead, I encourage taxpayers to understand their own situation before deciding how to move forward. Another question I hear all the time is, why does my balance keep increasing? The answer is usually found right on the notice. You'll often see separate amounts for failure to pay penalties and interest charges. Those amounts generally continue to change while a balance remain unpaid. That's why waiting often makes the balance larger over time. One of the biggest misconceptions I hear is, I'll just wait until I have enough money. Unfortunately, while you're waiting, penalties and interest may continue accumulating. That's one reason why it's often helpful to explore your options sooner rather than later. Another misunderstanding I see people make is believing they have to pay the entire balance before contacting the IRS. That's simply not true. Even if you can't pay the full amount today, you may still have options. The important thing is understanding what those options are before the situation progresses further. There's another section of this notice that sometimes catches people's attention. The IRS explains that if the balance remains unresolved, it may file a notice of federal tax lien or pursue other collection actions if appropriate. Now, I don't want that sentence to cause unnecessary panic. Remember, today's video is about the CP501 notice. A federal tax lien is an entirely separate topic with its own rules and procedures. In fact, we're going to dedicate an entire video to explaining federal tax liens because there's far more to that discussion than we could ever cover today. For now, I simply want to recognize that the IRS is explaining what may happen if the balance continues to remain unresolved. Whenever someone contacts my office after receiving an IRS notice, one of the first questions I ask is, do you have every notice the IRS has sent you? Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes they are throwing them away. Sometimes they only have the most recent one. Those notices tell a story. Each notice helps us understand where the taxpayer is in the IRS collection process. That's one reason I always recommend keeping every IRS notice you receive, even if you don't fully understand it today. It may become very important later. Here's what I want you to remember. Receiving a CP501 doesn't mean you've run out of options. It means the IRS still believes there's an unpaid balance. That's why I encourage taxpayers to treat notices as opportunities to gather information, ask questions, understand their options, and make informed decisions. Ignoring the notice rarely improves the situation. Understanding it often does. Understanding it often does. Now that we've talked about what the CP501 is and what it isn't, let's finish by answering some of the most common questions I receive from taxpayers about this notice. Question 1. Can I still set up a payment plan after receiving a 501? In many situations, yes. Receiving a CP 501 does not automatically prevent you from exploring payment options with the IRS. If paying the balance in full isn't possible today, you may still have other options depending on your circumstances. Question 2. Will the IRS garnish my wages because I received this notice? Not because you received the CP 501. Remember, today's notice is still part of the IRS collection notice process. There are additional legal steps before the IRS can generally begin levy actions. We'll discuss those in a later series. Question 3. What if I never received the CP14 notice? That happens more often than people realize. Mail gets delayed. People move. Addresses change. Sometimes taxpayers simply overlook a notice. The important thing isn't trying to figure out why you didn't receive an earlier notice. The important thing is understanding the notice that's in front of you today. Question number 4. What if I disagree with the balance the IRS says I owe? Don't assume that the IRS is always correct. Also, don't assume that the IRS is also wrong. Compare the notice with your own records. Review your return. Gather your documents. If necessary, contact the IRS or speak with a qualified tax professional to better understand why the IRS believe there's still a balance due. Question number 5. Should I ignore this notice if I can't pay? Absolutely not. No. One of the biggest mistakes I see taxpayers make is believing if I can't pay, there's nothing I can do. That's simply not true. Even when someone can't immediately pay the balance in full, there still may be options available depending on their circumstances. Ignoring the notice usually reduces your options. Understanding it helps you make informed decisions. And question number 6, should I hire a tax professional? That depends on your situation. Some taxpayers are comfortable reviewing their notices and handling the matter themselves. Others benefit from professional guidance, especially if multiple tax years are involved. The balance continues growing or the collection process becomes more complicated. The important thing is making an informed decision before the situation becomes much more difficult to resolve. Final thoughts. Let's wrap everything up. Today, we learned that the CP501 notice is essentially the IRS following up because, according to its records, there's still an unpaid balance. We discussed why you received another notice, how the CP501 differs from the CP514. The CP14. What information you should review carefully. The payment and resolution options referenced in the notice. Why reading the entire notice is important. What may happen if the balance continues to remain unresolved. And more importantly, I hope today's video helped remove some of the uncertainty that often comes with receiving an IRS notice. Knowledge reduces stress, and understanding your options put you in a much better position to decide what to do next. If you are dealing with IRS notices, unfiled returns, wage garnishments, tax debts, or any other IRS issues, schedule a consultation with Profit First Taxes. The link is in the description below. Even if you aren't ready to hire someone today, subscribe to the channel. Every week, I'll be sharing information to help you understand your options and avoid costly mistakes with the IRS. Next week, we'll continue moving through the IRS collection timeline by discussing the CP503 notice. We'll talk about why the language in the IRS notice begins changing, what the IRS is trying to communicate, and why understanding the progression of these notices is so important before collection process advance further. I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you for watching.